Great, thank you. And huge thanks to the SWCA team for helping to organize this. And I will try to go through a few slides really quickly just to kind of give a flavor of some of the needs for aquifer mapping and monitoring. And I'm really hoping to hear from a lot of you about ways that you can see this information be useful for things beyond what I'm talking about here today. While I'm on this slide, I just want to mention that here at the Bureau of Geology, we have three main programs for under the hydrogeology umbrella, among many other programs at the Bureau of Geology. I am in charge of the hydrogeology group, which includes the aquifer mapping efforts that I'm talking about today, the Water Data Act implementation, which is a team of folks here that coordinate with other state agencies and federal and local and regional data providers, and then the New Mexico Water Education Program, which is really aimed at providing water information to people in decision-making roles in New Mexico. So many of you may have been on an invite for things like these for water data or education. And so that's all coming around this area at the Bureau of Geology. Okay, you can go to the next slide, please. So just a tiny bit of background what the Aquifer Mapping Program works to do is provide multidisciplinary research on our water resources, particularly focused around groundwater, but also how it interacts with surface water across the state. And we've been doing this officially since 2006. Our funding has been small over the years, something on the order of 200 to 300,000 of annual funding from the state. And we combine that with any other funding we're able to get our hands on from grants and philanthropic contributions to accomplish the goals that I'll talk more about for mapping our aquifers in New Mexico. Sometimes when I look at the fact that we've been doing this for almost 2 decades, I get a little distressed that we haven't solved all of these problems and answered all of the New Mexico aquifer questions that are out there. But I point to the fact that New Mexico has some of the most interesting and complex geology of any of the states across the country. The geologic map there on the right shows a variety of different colors. Each of those colors represent a different geologic unit that has different hydrologic characteristics, both water quality and quantity, kind of represented in that geology. And as you can see, there's a lot of black lines and little red dots. And those are faults, which disrupt our aquifer units in different ways. And red dots being little volcanic units that also interact with our groundwater as well. And the cross section at the bottom is just a slice through southern New Mexico, just highlighting again the complexity that we find in the subsurface and some of the reasons why it's not a simple thing to just map all of the aquifers for New Mexico and be done with it. So we're working on it. Okay, next slide, please. The areas that we've covered so far across the state are covered here on the left-hand side map, which the gray areas are places where we've completed some sort of aquifer study, and the green are areas where we're actively working. Different types of studies, depending on the funding that's available, we're able to answer different kinds of questions about aquifers. The map on the right shows locations where we're trying to track groundwater level changes. This is funded through philanthropy from the Healy Foundation. And so this is a growing network that we're also working to increase funding for. And I'll talk about that in more detail here shortly. Next slide. So as Erica mentioned, there's a lot of push from various state and I would say other entities in the country to have a better understanding of what the water resources are here in New Mexico. Specifically for us and the aquifer mapping and monitoring efforts, the Governor's Water Action Plan calls for us to characterize all of our major and minor aquifers across the state. And there's a timeline on that. Major aquifers have to be characterized according to this plan by 2032, and that we're to build a groundwater monitoring network so we can actually have a sense of what's happening across the state with at least 100 new dedicated monitoring wells by 2037. And all of this is stated in the Water Action Plan that based on full funding that we would be able to implement and accomplish these things by these dates. Next slide. So as I said, that those are the big goals from the Water Action Plan. And so what we've done is really begun to work in earnest to fund that effort from a variety of sources. We're working right now to increase our recurring funding from the state to support the positions that we need to implement this long-term plan. And so this fiscal year, starting right now in July, we have substantially increased our state funding from just under 300,000 to now 800,000 annually recurring. So we are working to fill some new FTEs to address this goal. And the non-recurring part, I think, is, if you click once again, Emily, the non-recurring part is what we're really working on right now, which is trying to piece together the funding that we would need to build that monitoring network and really characterize the aquifers for New Mexico. And there's a variety of ways we do that. You can go to the next slide. I will talk about those ways to characterize aquifers here shortly. But what we're focusing on here today a bit more is thinking about how we might address the need for perhaps installing exploration wells and turning those into monitoring wells. Some work that we did back in 2023 is explained in an open file report that is on the screen right now. This work was funded by Thornburg Foundation, actually. They gave us funding for 1 year to try to look at all of the entire state of New Mexico and say, okay, where should we be monitoring groundwater more, and how might the state or others build funding to do that? And so this meeting is actually a really good follow-up for the work that was presented in this. One thing I'll say about this particular report, and I think we'll see some other images on this in the further discussions in today's meeting, we were given about a year and a limited amount of funding to cover the entire state. So what we ended up doing was focusing our work on priority regions, just because we couldn't do the entire state altogether. So we picked 10 critical regions based on input from folks at the state engineer's office and a variety of consultants and a few other folks who work on groundwater issues. And the 10 regions are, I think if you click onto the next slide, highlighted is green polygons on the map here. And those are the administrative groundwater basins that the Office of the State Engineer has on their efforts that these are the polygons that they use. So within each of those 10 high priority regions, we were able to closely evaluate what groundwater monitoring looks like in those areas, and then make some suggestions for where new wells could be drilled that would fill a critical gap. In those 10 priority regions, things like where we're already seeing groundwater level declines happening, where there are limited supplies for public systems in terms of groundwater primarily, or no surface water available. So those are areas where those are high priority. And I think there were a few other criteria that were why these regions were selected, but I think this total project covers about less than 20% of the state. So this is kind of a proxy for the number of wells we are working towards. So if you click again on this, so on this website URL that I have listed here, there's actually an interactive map where you can go and see where active monitoring is happening and click on a point. And the points are actually symbolized by whether water levels are going up or water levels are going down, or they're static, which is, the static is a little yellow bar, fairly stable water levels. Up is the green triangles pointing up, and down is the orange triangles pointing down. So you can click on a point on this map and it pulls up data from a range of sources, including the USGS, our groundwater monitoring network that we provide at the Bureau of Geology, and a few other regional data providers. So this is an important tool that we were able to build from that project. Next slide. And I think the major takeaway from that report, as well as work that we've been doing over the years, is that we're really not adequately tracking what's happening in our groundwater in New Mexico. We measure with our philanthropy-supported groundwater monitoring network, we measure about 200 wells annually, and there's a number of other wells that we get data provided to us. Those wells are on the map here as the red points. The USGS has been cooperating with the Office of the State Engineer for several years, and they have shifted to measuring about 800 wells annually that the state and USGS cooperatively fund that monitoring, and those are the gray points on the map here. And as you look at the map, you can see that there's some pretty good coverage in our more populated regions and perhaps in regions where there are some concerning groundwater level declines happening, such as on the eastern side of the state. But also, there's a lot of gaps. There's a lot of rural and remote regions where we do have public water systems that are there's no information about what's going on in trends in their groundwater levels. So the USGS sites are measured annually typically, so once a year, and in some cases that's really not enough to see what the trends are. So there's a time issue of frequency of measurement. And then also these wells are typically somebody's private domestic well or their irrigation well. These are wells that are not drilled for the purpose of monitoring. So we may or may not have actual depth, total depth of the well. We may not have any information on the screened intervals of those wells. And so these are kind of like wells of opportunity, but not a dedicated monitoring network, which may capture the full aquifer or multiple aquifers at depth in the same location. So this is a really important aspect that we're monitoring, but not in a very super focused way. And any of these wells that are privately owned could obviously be taken back, remove access permissions. And so that's another part why some wells drop off of these networks. Next slide. So the kind of work that we are aiming to do over the next 10 to 15 years in this context of aquifer mapping and monitoring are listed here. Really what we're trying to do is really characterize all of the aquifers of New Mexico. Some places we have a good start on that. We're talking about both the fresh and the brackish water so that we can consider alternative supplies. And we're really working on building short-term and long-term funding to support the characterization and long-term monitoring efforts. So what we are talking about largely here today, I've highlighted, which is thinking about how we might go towards infrastructure around exploring at depth our groundwater infrastructure, but also installing wells that can then be reused for monitoring. So as we drill through the subsurface, we can collect a lot of information all the way down through a formation into the next formation. We can collect information about what's the water quality of different zones in the subsurface, what are the hydrologic properties, how well does water move through those formations in the subsurface, and then thinking about how do they get recharged. If it's really, really old water, we might want to think about that as we're pushing towards some sort of desal facility as an option for a particular region. In order to characterize some of our aquifers without subsurface information and with some well information, there's a lot more we can do if we are able to do geophysical surveys. So these are land-based or aerial-based surveys that allow us to get a subsurface picture using different techniques that help us kind of see through the rocks and have a better sense of what the behavior of those materials might be and what water might be available in those. So that's a fairly expensive endeavor, but it's going to be a much faster way to get to the answers that we need about what our groundwater resources really look like. We'll also be thinking about water chemistry. We're thinking about desal as an option. We really need to know exactly what the water quality is. And as we're thinking about protecting our freshwater aquifers, utilizing nearby other aquifers, deeper aquifers or brackish water aquifers, we really need to know exactly what the chemistry is all throughout the subsurface. I list hydraulic testing. So doing pumping tests on aquifers is a really important way for us to know how that is going to behave. There's an example from the Clovis area where they explored the water in the formations below the Ogallala and found that they are not exactly productive. So that's why some of these concerns are happening out in that region, where their formations are very tight and don't move water quickly through it. So it's not a viable resource for an alternative. Just to real quickly highlight, the rest of this is thinking about how water moves through the flow path from recharge to where we're using it. If it's 20,000-year-old water that we're pulling out from the subsurface, that helps us know that it is not being recharged in the lifetime of humans. So we may want to think differently about what that looks like in terms of sustainability. And then I'll just jump to number 9. I think it's really important that we as a state have complete and total access to the data that are collected. There's a number of private and consultant reports that talk about some of these features that we're listing here, but they're not open and accessible. So the work that I have been doing here at the Bureau of Geology and what we're proposing to do going forward is to make all that data fully accessible so that other people can use it, and there's other things that can come out of this. So that's aligning with the New Mexico Water Data Act, which is that we make all of our data open and accessible. Next slide. I'm almost done. One of the things I just wanted to kind of highlight is how having this information can help improve our long-term outcomes in New Mexico. So thinking about having our aquifers more fully characterized gives us some better sense of how we can protect the water quality. So going forward in New Mexico, I expect, and many of us know, that we'll see increasing temperatures and reduced surface water availability, something on the order of 25% less surface water. That little bit of surface water that we have also reduces the amount of recharge that we're getting to our aquifers. And so we really need to be thoughtful about recharge projects and thinking about how we're going to protect the little bit of surface water, that keep that water quality as pristine as possible, but then also how that affects as it infiltrates into our limited groundwater resources. We were just having a conversation on a trip I was on recently, thinking about how climate change is affecting our coastal communities and kind of that climate effect of migrating communities. And so I think here in New Mexico, what that looks like is that perhaps some smaller communities where there are not large groundwater supplies and no surface water supplies are expecting, groundwater outages or water supply outages, and we're seeing that happen now. We've heard about this in the news, and sometimes that's a short-term effect, just for a few months, but sometimes it's more of a long-term water outage, where like things that we're seeing in eastern central New Mexico right now. And so I think having the thought ahead of how we're going to mitigate these sorts of impacts, so that either communities are supported to have alternative supplies, or supported to kind of transition away from heavy water use practices, really needs to be thought out. And thinking about that, we need to have that detailed information about what exactly is happening in the groundwater. And so that monitoring network that we're proposing, we can install wells with dedicated monitoring devices that can help us have a real-time sense of what's happening in the trends in those rural communities or wherever it is that is facing long-term changes in their groundwater. There's a lot that we can be utilizing from aquifer characterization that helps us make more informed, thoughtful decisions about how we're going to use some of the alternatives for water supply. So if we're going to be thinking about utilizing brackish water in a particular area, we really need to have that information on what exactly that water quality is in the brackish water aquifer, how that brackish water aquifer behaves with regard to freshwater aquifers nearby or rivers nearby. And then also thinking with desal in particular, where we might be putting waste products. So there's a lot that we can be more informed about in those decision-making processes, that if we have details about all of the aquifer structures, in a location, we can think, okay, how we can put this waste product much, much deeper at 10,000 feet. We can inject it. It won't affect any of our other water supplies. Something like that might be a little bit more informed by having this information available. And also, smaller communities who are starting to contemplate a regionalization effort where there may be connecting multiple water supplies physically or just in a conceptual way. It's good to know what those resources, what their trends are if they have multiple wells in an area. Having detailed information about how those aquifers are behaving or what the water quality is can help them be a little bit more strategic about how they move forward on supporting each other in regionalization efforts. And then for sure, the effort that we're proposing here helps us have better information about what recharge in terms of artificial recharge or injection might look like. The map on the right here is some work that we did a few years ago for the Albuquerque Water Authority, where we mapped the subsurface units in the Santa Fe group around Albuquerque in detail so that they can be thinking about where they might do artificial recharge for either infiltration galleries. There's other maps that are much more shallow. And then this map here shows where they might be able to do suitable practices for deep injection for recharge into those aquifers around Albuquerque. Next slide. I think that's it. There's my contact info. And that is it for my short presentation.